What's the emergency?
No problem. All units are by
I'm at the corner of Pleasant Hill and John Young Freeway.
1519 East 18.
Welcome back to Crime Solvers Central, the podcast where we dive deep into the darkest, most complex criminal cases in modern history. I'm Jayce.
And I'm Charlie. And today, we're stepping into a story of a man who changed the definition of serial killer. A man whose brutality and cunning allowed him to go undetected for over 40 years.
His name is Samuel Little. And according to the FBI, he is the most prolific serial killer in American history.
Not Bundy, not Gacy, not Dahmer. Samuel Little confessed to 93 murders. Law enforcement has confirmed over 60, and his victims were women, often marginalized, often forgotten, and no one saw his pattern for decades.
Today, we're telling you how this man got away with it for so long, who his victims were, how the justice system failed them, and what's still being done today to bring closure.
Because many of Samuel Little's victims still remain unidentified. Many have never been found, and some of his confessions are still waiting for someone to recognize a face, a memory, a clue.
So, let's start at the beginning, with a boy born into instability, violence, and eventually, a monstrous path of destruction.
Samuel Little was born as Samuel McDow on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His mother was allegedly a teenage sex worker and possibly even gave birth to him while in jail.
His father, Paul McDow, was only 19, but Samuel never really knew him. He was raised mostly by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, a steel town with a strong working-class population, and not a place known for opportunity, especially for young Black kids with little support.
By his own account, Little started having dark thoughts at a very young age. He talked about being aroused when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her own neck, which turned into fantasies of strangulation.
By his teens, those fantasies merged with real-world violence. He was caught stealing, breaking into homes, and was eventually sent to juvenile detention at age 16.
The criminal justice system became his home turf from then on. He never really had a stable job, though he worked odd gigs: cemetery worker, ambulance attendant, truck driver, and most notably, he took up boxing. That's important because he used his strength to overpower his victims later on.
Let's talk about the sheer scale of his early criminal behavior. By 1975, Little had already been arrested 26 times in 11 states. That included everything from theft, assault, attempted rape, and even attacking police officers.
But here's the kicker. Despite that long list, he was never convicted of murder during those early decades. Every time he was arrested, he slipped through the cracks. Weak evidence, unreliable witness, or just flat out disinterest from law enforcement.
That's going to become a recurring theme today. He kept killing, and the system kept missing him.
And by the early 1980s, his crimes turned lethal and left a trail of bodies from Mississippi to California.
In 1982, he was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, suspected of killing 22-year-old Melinda LaPree, who had gone missing earlier that fall.
But again, the grand jury declined to indict him. Why? The evidence was circumstantial. No witnesses could place him at the scene definitively, so he walked free.
Then he was extradited to Florida to face charges for the murder of Patricia Mount. Again, nothing stuck. Witnesses weren't seen as reliable. Little was acquitted in 1984.
This is when he moved to California, settling in San Diego first, then Los Angeles. And it's in LA that Samuel Little would go on to kill at least 10 more women, maybe more.
And still, no one saw the pattern. No one made the connection. These women were found dead in alleys, vacant lots, dumpsters, often strangled, often listed as drug overdoses or undetermined causes.
And Little, he just kept moving on.
Samuel Little is a former boxer, now 79 years old and in custody in California. His claims are not new, but tonight the FBI is calling Little the worst U.S. serial killer ever, just based on the 50 murders they've been able to verify he committed. The I-Team has learned that number is expected to increase. Among those still being investigated are 2 in Illinois.
So let's talk about Samuel Little's MO. His method for killing was disturbingly simple and effective. He strangled his victims, usually with his bare hands.
No knife, no gun, no weapon, no blood. That meant no obvious cause of death in many cases. And in forensic terms, especially in the 70s and 80s, that often led to a tragic misclassification. Natural causes, or a drug overdose.
And there was something else. He was careful and calculated. He picked victims who were marginalized, women who, in his words, wouldn't be missed.
We're talking about sex workers, people struggling with addiction, trans women, homeless women, women of color. He even said once, "I never killed no senators or governors. I stayed in the ghettos."
That quote is hard to hear because it's true. These were victims who were overlooked by society and overlooked by law enforcement.
That's part of what made Little so hard to catch. He preyed on people the system already didn't protect.
Let's step back and think about the scope here. 93 confessions, over 60 confirmed. That puts him ahead of Gary Ridgway, ahead of John Wayne Gacy, ahead of everyone.
He operated for 35 years, from 1970 to 2005. That's a lifetime. Whole generations passed while he was out there killing.
And geographically, this was nationwide. Mississippi, California, Florida, Ohio, Nevada, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, and more. He left a web of unsolved murders across the map.
And remember, during all this time, he was arrested over and over again for robbery, assault, drug charges, solicitation, attempted rape. But it took until 2012 for the system to catch him for murder.
That's nearly a half a century after his first likely kill.
So let's address the obvious question. How does someone commit this many murders and never get caught?
It comes down to 3 factors: mobility, victim selection, and systemic failure.
First, mobility. Little was constantly on the move. He never stayed in one place long. Sometimes he'd live out of his car. He didn't have a pattern that stuck to a single region.
That meant no jurisdiction ever saw the full picture. Local police were dealing with isolated cases, and many of those cases weren't even filed as homicides.
Second, victimology. These were people on the margins. People who often didn't have family members pushing police for answers. In some cases, they weren't even reported missing.
And third, let's call it what it was: systemic apathy. There was a culture in law enforcement at the time where victims like these just didn't get the resources. Their cases weren't prioritized.
You ever heard the term less dead? Because that's what this is. These women were treated as less dead because society didn't value them alive.
Let's go over some of the known confirmed victims that finally got Samuel Little convicted.
First was Carol Eileene Alfred, murdered in 1987. She was found in a Los Angeles alley, strangled, partially undressed. Years later, her case was matched to Little through DNA evidence.
Then there was Guadalupe Apodaca, killed in 1989, and Audrey Nelson Everett, also in 1989. Both found strangled in Los Angeles, one behind an abandoned repair shop, the other in a dumpster.
These women were found, yes, but the cause of death didn't raise alarms back then. It wasn't until DNA linked Little to all three that they reopened the cases.
In 2014, a jury convicted him for those murders, and finally, at age 74, Samuel Little was sentenced to life in prison.
But that was just the beginning, because after that verdict, he started to talk.
She was pretty, a light-skinned, brown, honey-colored kin. And she was she was tall for a woman, about 5'8", 5'9", and it's beautiful shape, and she's friendly.
And how much do you think she weighed?
After his 2014 conviction, Samuel Little stayed mostly silent, until Texas Ranger James Holland came calling in 2018.
Holland was investigating an old cold case, the 1994 murder of Denise Christie Brothers in Odessa, Texas. And when he confronted Little, something clicked.
Little confessed to the murder, and then he confessed to another, and another, and another. It didn't stop.
He just started talking, drawing, naming, over 700 hours of interviews. Holland would later say it was like interviewing someone who was addicted to memory.
And it's true. Little's memory was shockingly detailed. He remembered the cars he was driving, the streets he parked on, even the shoes his victims wore.
But what chilled investigators was his attitude. He didn't seem remorseful. He relished the details. He'd call the women my babies. He'd say he loved some of them.
It was like he was retelling some of his favorite stories. Only his stories were about murder.
Now let's talk about the portraits, because this is one of the strangest parts of the entire case.
Samuel Little could draw really well. He had a talent for capturing people's faces. And when Holland gave him art supplies, Little started sketching the women he had killed, from memory.
He created dozens of pastel portraits, almost all of them Black women, many with distinctive hairstyles, makeup, or jewelry.
And here's what's wild. Many of these women had never been identified. No police report, no missing persons case, nothing.
So the FBI did something unprecedented. They released the sketches to the public in 2018, hoping someone would recognize a face, a friend, a sister, a daughter.
And some did. A few of those Jane Does finally got names. It was closure for families who had waited decades without answers.
But many of those portraits still remain unmatched. Their stories untold, their identities erased by time and systemic neglect.
Now, we're not psychologists, but it's worth digging into how Samuel Little talked about these murders.
He described a high, a kind of thrill like a drug. One quote sticks out. He said, "It was like drugs. I came to like it."
He also claimed, bizarrely, that God told him to do it, that he was removing the misery from these women's lives.
Other times, he blamed the devil. So depending on the day, he either saw himself as a savior or a demon.
But through it all, there was no remorse, no empathy, just storytelling. He enjoyed being the narrator of his own horror anthology.
And when you watch the interrogation footage, you see it. He's calm, confident, proud even.
It's hard to watch, but it's necessary, because it shows us what evil with a long memory really looks like.
At the same time Little was confessing to Holland, a journalist named Jillian Lauren was also sitting across from him with a pen and notebook.
She originally set out to write a crime novel, but when LAPD detective Mitzi Roberts casually mentioned she helped catch this serial killer named Sam Little, Jillian's curiosity exploded.
Lauren met with Little over 40 hours of interviews. She became one of the only people he opened up to. And in those conversations, he revealed even more details about his crimes.
She later said he remembered everything about his victims, their faces, their makeup, their shoes, but not their names.
Jillian wrote a deeply personal book called Behold the Monster, published in 2023. She didn't just profile Little, she centered the victims.
And that's important, because this story isn't just about the killer. It's about the people he silenced.
So where does that leave us? After 93 confessions, more than 60 confirmed, and over a dozen portraits still unmatched, this story isn't closed.
Even now, the FBI, the Texas Rangers, and local departments across 19 states are working to match Little's descriptions with cold cases.
But the challenge is huge. Some of these victims were never reported missing. Others were misidentified, and some we just don't have records for.
This is why public awareness matters, because somewhere, someone might recognize a sketch, a name, a location.
Samuel Little died in 2020, but he left behind a trail that is still being untangled by detectives, by families, and by everyday people who might know more than they think.
History. 78-year-old Samuel Little currently sits in a Texas jail cell where he now claims to have murdered more than 90 people in nearly half a century.
The details he gave were so close to what happened, law enforcement authorities were able to close these cases out.
The FBI says so far they've corroborated 36 of them.
For every story Samuel Little told, there was a family left in the dark. A daughter who never came home, a mother who died not knowing what happened, a case that sat in a file drawer for 30 years.
And when the FBI started matching his confessions to real victims, those families got something most cold case families never do: answers. But the pain doesn't go away. It only shifts.
Take the case of Zena Marie Jones, for example. Her body was found in 1990, dumped along the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River. It wasn't until 2022, over 30 years later, that her identity was confirmed after her family recognized Little's sketch.
Imagine that. Decades of silence. And then one day, you see a face that looks like your sister on the FBI website, drawn by her killer.
Closure is important, but it's complicated. Some families feel relief, others feel rage, many feel both. But most of them share this thought: she mattered. Now people know she existed.
The case didn't end when Little died in December 2020. The investigation is still alive. Dozens of his confessions still remain unmatched to any known murder.
The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, continues to cross-reference his confessions with missing persons reports, unidentified remains, and cold case files.
And they've had help from the Texas Rangers, local PDs across the country, and forensic anthropologists who've reopened cases declared as overdoses or undetermined deaths.
That's why you, the listener, might actually hold the key to solving one of these cases.
If you think you recognize one of Little's portraits, if you remember a woman who vanished in the 70s, 80s, or 90s under mysterious circumstances, or if you know someone whose case was never solved,
contact law enforcement. Here's how. Call the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI, submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov, or email the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit at rangers@dps.texas.gov.
We also encourage you to visit the Samuel Little Confession Map at fbi.gov/Samuel Little. There you'll find dozens of portraits. If one of them looks familiar, reach out.
And if you've already submitted a tip, follow up. Law enforcement wants help on this. They've said it repeatedly. Time is running out.
So why does this story matter? Why spend time talking about a killer who most people didn't even know about until recently?
Because this case reveals more than just Samuel Little. It shows how deeply broken systems can become. It exposes how some lives are treated as less important, both in life and in death.
It's about bias, neglect, and how racism, classism, and misogyny created the perfect environment for a serial killer to hide in plain sight.
And it's also a story about persistence, about the investigators, like James Holland, who never gave up, about families who kept asking questions, and about journalists like Jillian Lauren, who gave a voice back to the women who were silenced.
If we want to stop the next Samuel Little, we have to care about every victim, regardless of background, regardless of circumstances. Everyone matters.
We want to thank you for sticking with us through this episode. These are hard stories to hear, but they need to be told.
We'll continue to cover cases like this here on Crime Solver Central. So be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and let us know if there's cases you'd like us to investigate or highlight.
If you learned something today, share this episode. You never know who might hold the missing piece of the puzzle.
And if you have any tips, memories, or photos from any of the regions or years we've talked about, especially if you lived in those areas during the 70s through the early 2000s, please consider reaching out.
We'll leave you with this. Samuel Little may be dead, but his victims deserve names. Their families deserve peace, and the truth deserves daylight.
Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay loud.